Thank you for your welcome today. I want to a special thank you to the Law Center here, as well as the staff to the Bantayog. Without the staff from the Bantayog, we would not be here. And it has been a very emotional journey for the group of 10 that has traveled to celebrate Silme Domingo and Viernes' names on the wall. And it has always been our mission that in educating people about Silme and Jean's lives, their work, and their murders, that they would continue to contribute to being part of the collective memory of what the brutality of the dictatorship was. And so even 30 years after their deaths, they are still doing that. And so we are proud to be here with you in contributing to that collective memory so that this dictatorship or any other dictatorship will never, ever be in the Philippines again. At the same time, today's event, I just want to make clear I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to talk about who Silme and Jean were, as well as the legal case. And I think the Dean has raised some very important issues that are pertinent to our legal case in terms of international law, holding dictatorships accountable, the roles of government in upholding human rights for their peoples. But I think especially we want to look at what is the intersection between the mass movement and the legal systems in our country. And as well as, for our particular case, the role of the U.S. government in Silme and Jean's murders. So this is a lot to cover in 10 to 15 minutes, and so in the panel discussion we can take more questions, but as well, this should be a discussion. There are many people here that participated in this work, and so I'm not the only one that will possibly answer these questions. We have a number of people here from the KDP, Line of March, as well as those that work to get justice in the legal system in the United States for Silme and Jean. So I want to also give you a little insight on how we access justice and the complexity of getting justice. But just as important is we have still not gotten full justice in the murders of Silme and Jean. And that I'll leave to the end when I talk about the role of the U.S. government, who was complicit with the Philippine government, then under the Marcos dictatorship, in the murders of Silme and Jean. Originally when these murders happened, it was reflected as a case of internal union dispute. And when we exposed the conspiracy within 24 hours of who we thought was responsible for Silme and Jean's death, many people were shocked and said, how could this be in the United States, the so-called land of democracy? But when you look at this case and the murders, and you look at it in the context of the relationship, the colonial relationship between the U.S. and Philippines, the turbulent and militant history of the Alaska Cannery Workers Union, which was called then Local 37 of the International Longshore and Warehousemen's Union. When you look at that history, the militancy of that union, the role of the communists in that union, and in particular, you look at all of this, you look at the murders in the context of this, and the role of U.S. intelligence agencies and Philippine intelligence agencies, then you think, yes, these murders are what the KDP said these murders were about. These murders were ordered by the Marcoses, and yes, the U.S. was complicit in these murders and gave the nod to the Marcos regime to go ahead and carry out what you have to do. So let me go through just briefly who Salme and Jean were at the time of their deaths, and then our conspiracy, what we proved in court, what the conspiracy was. Salme and Jean were only 29 years old when they were both murdered in their union hall. They actually were Filipino-Americans born in the United States. Both of them had only been to the Philippines one time. And so their Filipino identity was formed at the period of in the midst of the Vietnam War and the Filipino identity movement. And their one trip to the Philippines helped solidify their love for the Philippines, the land of their parents. And Domingo Viernes actually had just only gone to the Philippines a little over a month before he died, 2 months before he died. At the time, Silme Domingo came from our family, was very active in the Filipino community, and was an emerging leader in the Seattle Filipino community, as well as at the University of Washington. Both men had gone to Alaska as teenagers. Domingo Viernes first went to Alaska to work side by side with his father at the age of 15. And they both became fighters against discrimination in Alaska cannery workers because of the experience of their fathers. So they already were labeled as troublemakers in the Filipino community, troublemakers in the labor movement, when they were very young, when they were still in their teens. And eventually, both joined the KDP. Silme was the co-founder of the Seattle chapter of the KDP. And both of them eventually became officers in the Alaska Cannery Workers Union. And they emerged as leaders of the reform movement to transform that union as a fighting union that worked for the rights of Alaska cannery workers. Now, if you know anything about the International Longshoremen's Union, they are one of the most powerful unions in the United States. They have international ties with other longshore. They load and unload cargo ships. So they are historically one of the unions nationally in the United States that can have a very grave impact if they take a position against certain governments. So like the dictatorship in Chile under Pinochet, they refused to unload cargo. And so you can see where it has an economic impact in which governments and dictatorships would take note of any labor movement that would have an economic impact on them. So Silme and Jean had gone to the Philippines in April of 1981, 2 months before their murders. He had gone both on a personal visit, but as well as a political visit to make ties with the labor movement led at that time by the May 1st labor union, the KMU.
Sorry.
And on return, and during that trip to the Philippines, Jean met with leaders of the KMU and began and was initiating ties that had been forged back in the 30s and 40s with the Alaska Cannery Workers Union. So they were continuing history from when their fathers and forefathers had originally built relationships between the progressive movement in the United States and the progressive movement in the Philippines. And Jean also went to the countryside to visit the MPA zones. And so we know that because of his activity at the time, that he was being heavily surveilled in the Philippines. And on his way home, he met Silme and other members of the Alaska Cannery Workers Union, and at the international convention of the ILWU, they fought for a resolution that would send a labor investigating team to the Philippines. And that was the first step that they knew that eventually they would, after the investigating team would go to the Philippines and look at the labor conditions that laborers worked under, that eventually they would come back to the next convention and pass a resolution condemning the Marcos dictatorship, especially around the labor conditions that workers faced. But before they could see their work come to fruition, they were murdered in their Seattle union offices on June 1st. Eventually, in the first year after the murders, so within 24 hours, Salme survived 24 hours. Jean was killed instantly. But before on the spot, Salme was able to identify the two men that shot him. And thus the murder conspiracy started to unravel. And within 24 hours, the KDP, because of its positioning in the community, because of their knowledge of who was who, because of who Salme and Jean were, we developed a conspiracy theory that stood the test of time. And it took us 8.5 years to prove that murder conspiracy in a civil suit, but that all of the interests that benefited from Salme and Jean's murder were uncovered. So we knew that there were hired hitmen who were paid to carry out the murders, whose interests were that they wanted to continue the corruption in the union. We knew that Salme and Jean were doing very important work in the union and in the KDP through their Philippine work in the KDP and the coalition against the Marcos dictatorship, that the Marcos dictatorship did not want for it to come to fruition. And as well, because of U.S.-Philippine relations, we knew that the United States interests were at stake in the Philippines, and that they also would benefit from the murders of Salme and Jean. So that this was not a union dispute, but these were highly paid and politically motivated murders. So in the first year, because we did not have the power to bring to, we solely did not have the power to bring the gunmen and prosecute them, we worked very closely with the prosecutors, forming the theory of why Salme and Jean were killed, bringing forth witnesses who could testify to our conspiracy. And the two hitmen, well, the three men, the head of the gang, as well as the two hitmen, through criminal trials, were brought to trial and were found guilty. And they are still serving life imprisonment without parole. But what we uncovered was that the president of the union, who was a close friend of the Marcos government, was involved in the murders. It was his gun that was used in the murders, but he was never brought to trial. There was actually more information. And at that point, after a year, when he was not brought to trial, we knew that the U.S. government was moving to protect him. Why? So that question remained in our minds for a very long time, and he was not convicted of the murders until after we won the civil suit. When we were at a standstill with not being able to prosecute the president of the union, we filed in 1982 a civil suit for $30 million against the U.S. and Philippine government, against the Marcoses as individuals. And we filed it at the same time as Marcos was making his first state visit to the United States in 16 years. We filed it as a class action lawsuit on behalf of members of the anti-Marcos movement in the United States and on behalf of Salme and Jean's families. And we filed it as a class action lawsuit because we wanted an injunction on what we have